Welcome everybody, and by request, a tasting of Riesling. And in 2 weeks' time, we have a tasting of winter reds, and there's some interesting reds there as well. And in 2 weeks' time, as well as the wines we're officially tasting, we'll be able to touch on a whole range of different red styles. Tonight, the subject is Riesling, and I find Riesling a very interesting subject. I personally enjoy Rieslings myself. I like them. They're probably, especially in warmer weather and when you're looking for a very, very fresh style, light-bodied, very refreshing style white wines. I think Riesling is a wonderful selection. The issue with Riesling is it's very misunderstood, and it also does have some controversial tastes about it, which I'll talk about. And then we'll have a little tasting of these interesting array of wines that we have in front of us here tonight. In Australia, wine really boomed as far as consumers are concerned from the mid-late 1970s onwards. So widespread consumer enjoyment of wine in Australia is a relatively new thing. Getting on for 40 or so years now. But prior to this sort of era of widespread consumer acceptance of wine in Australia, the wine was sort of consumed by a few who knew a bit about it, and most Australians drank beer and spirits and tea and things like that with meals. Of course, the European migration in the 1950s and the 1960s changed all that, because those European migrants matured and suddenly started promoting, drinking wine and their own food styles and restaurants and so on. And one of the first wine styles that was put in front of Australians to make a lot of Australian consumers get interested in wine very quickly was a semi-sweet Riesling Gewürztraminer blend. And if you're as old as me, you'll remember the wine. It was called Lindemann's Benin Moselle, and it was where Australia used to be able to pinch the European place name. And millions of Australians discovered wine by trying Lindemann's Benin Moselle, which is a good thing because it got people into wine. The bad thing was that a huge number of people in the 70s and 80s and 90s thought that Riesling was a sweet, fruity wine. And it was, you could slosh it around and it wasn't great quality. And certainly cheap blended Riesling white wine can be a bit like that. What actually happened in Australia was that the Riesling, certainly the semi-sweet Riesling style, that got so many people hooked, that fad passed on, and Chardonnay took over in the 1990s, really, probably the late 80s, really. But anyway, certainly Chardonnay took over, and really in terms of Riesling's widespread popularity, Riesling in Australia, certainly as far as consumers goes, it never went back to the era of the 1970s and 80s, where it was so common to see Australian Riesling and Riesling blends. And when they were a blend of, say, Gewürztraminer and Riesling, they were called Traminer Riesling for short. And there were just so many wines of that type. Faded out now. Very hard to actually find a Traminer Riesling or anything named after that these days. It just shows you how the market changed so much. A similar thing occurred in the UK and a little bit with Germany in the aftermath of after the Second World War, really, especially in the 1960s, when the UK consumer was discovering wine. A couple of wines were very popular. German white wine was very popular, and there's a German brand called Blue Nun, which is still made, and it's actually very good wine, really, but it's a low alcohol, fruity, slightly sweet Riesling. And there are a number of others as well, but certainly Blue Nun was very, very famous. And Blue Nun was selling millions of cases of wine into the UK market. I think it probably still does sell a lot, but enormous number of British consumers of that era. At the same time, Australians had learned about Riesling being this fruity, sweet wine. The British consumers also thought that Riesling meant sweet wine, sweet, light table wine. And it was what was even more difficult was that the UK consumer thought that German wine was light and sweet and not particularly high quality. And to this day, Germany struggled to get back to be considered a super premium producing country, even though there's a very high volume of wine being made. Amongst the connoisseurs and people who know a fair bit about wine, German wine is sought after, and I'll come to that in a moment. Certainly the deliberately later picked German Rieslings, which have a grading system based upon their ripeness, their sugar content from natural ripeness, and they have names such as Spätlese and Auslese and Beerenauslese and Trockenbeerenauslese, which is a scale of increasing sweetness. And those wines have very intense grapiness, but a lovely natural sweetness on them. And by the time you are tasting Beerenauslese and Trockenbeerenauslese, those wines are very much dessert wine style. They're very sweet indeed, but they're fabulous wines made in very small quantities, and they're very expensive. So German wine has struggled in its image making, and Riesling struggled as a result. And in Australia to this day, Riesling struggles. The biggest production area of Riesling is South Australia. Biggest production in Australia, is South Australia. And not quite sure what the percentage, but something like 90% of South Australian Riesling stays in South Australia, and it's consumed by South Australians. So when you go to Adelaide and you go to an Adelaide restaurant, there's quite a few Rieslings on the wine list, and Adelaideans drink it. It's a bit like Hunter Valley Semion. When you go to Sydney restaurants, you see Hunter Valley Semion. Once you get away from the Sydney market, and certainly outside New South Wales, you never see Hunter Valley Semion, even though it's such a gorgeous white wine. And South Australian Riesling is also a gorgeous wine, but it is not that often seen really, and it's a pity about that. One of the things about it is that it usually retains, Australian Rieslings, like German Rieslings, retain quite a degree of acidity. And if they're made dry, the wine tends to have a very piercing, slightly sour, tart, cutting flavour. Wonderful with a whole lot of food, and wonderful serve, really chilled on hot days, lunchtime or early evenings and so on. And a lot of people don't go for that sort of style, that very dry, that really penetrating acidity thing. But it's certainly a particular style which it's got a big following nonetheless, and something to seek out. Without further ado, that's the introduction to Riesling. So look out for the acidity and this penetrating, bracing, savoury sourness. Let's just try the wine zone. We'll talk a bit more in detail about all this. So the first one I have here is the German wine, which is from the Saar, which is a sort of a region just off to the side of the Mosel River Valley. And I've got a map to show you in a moment, but let's just taste it first. I'll come back to the aroma in a moment, but just a sniff and a taste. And it's got the grapiness on the aroma. It's light, and it's a little bit sweet, just a little bit. And the actual degree of fairly firm acidity that you often would traditionally associate with Germany is not really present. Germany, like all countries all around the world, since 2014 until 2021, we're seeing the benefit of wonderful, warm, even vintages. And so where Germany being such a long way from the equator, one of the most northern regions there is, always traditionally would struggle to get super ripeness, because by the time the grapes are starting to ripen, it's late in autumn and the temperatures dropped. And one of the stories of Germany are the fact that the grapes are grown on the rocky, steep hillsides, so that when the sun's very low in the sky at the end of the day in autumn, the sun's still got this penetration of the sun heat and the ultraviolet. And if they grow the rows up the steep hillsides, the rows don't shade each other. And one of the secrets of Germany actually achieving a degree of ripeness was to have those very steep hillsides, because it's such a cold area. So traditionally, German Riesling was very tart, very acidic, but Germany's been having these warm vintages. So that wine there's nice grapey aroma, a little bit sweet, certainly fresh and crisp, but not as acidic as what Germany was always renowned for. Moving along to the Australian wine, which is the second one. This is Clare Valley Riesling, which I suppose it's always an argument, but Clare Valley and Eden Valley. So Clare Valley is about 2 hours north of Adelaide, and Eden Valley is about an hour north of Adelaide. But Eden Valley is really up in the hills to the east of the Barossa Valley. And a lot of people consider Eden Valley sort of really part of the Barossa Valley, just a bit higher up in altitude. And there's a lot of Riesling in Eden Valley, a lot of Riesling in Clare Valley. And I'll talk about the differences a bit later on, but this one's Clare Valley Riesling. And this is, in years gone by, if I'd had these first two wines and couldn't see the labels, I would probably say that the middle one was the German wine. It's quite tart and acidic. It's got that tart acidity that you associate with cold climate Riesling. Well, Clare is cold climate, but not as cold as Germany. The interesting thing about this is one of the great things that to bear in mind when you are evaluating Riesling. I don't know about you, but if you've got that same wine as me, I can still taste that Riesling now. It's got such wonderful concentration for such a light-bodied wine, so delicate. And the acidity, yes, you see it. It's got very penetrating, sour, unsweetened lime juice acidity on it, but it balances pretty well. And it's even though it's such a delicate wine, the persistence is wonderful. And that's one of the things you do see about a good quality Riesling. They can just linger and linger. And because wines with great persistence are absolutely wonderful with food. So that Clare Valley Riesling, it's got quite a good palate coating. You know, you can taste it all over your tongue. The acidity's there, it's firm, but it's integrated in. There's some mid-palate richness and creaminess as well. And the palate coating feel of that wine, you can just taste for a long time afterwards. Lovely persistence. And, you know, we've discussed before in these sessions that when you have a wine of great persistence, it's the wine you come back to. It goes better with food. You know, you'll find yourself zeroing in on wines that have got persistence when you start choosing your own wines. If we go to the third wine, which is the Tasmanian Riesling, and this one also has got a light, sweet, grapey aroma. And that wine is obviously quite sweet. There's quite a degree of sweetness there, and it's also got freshness as well. And I'm just sort of measuring myself now, the persistence. It's starting to fade now. So even though it's got a bigger initial, you know, attack and effect on the palate than the Clare Valley Riesling, it fades away much faster. And as we've discussed before, you can't cheat with persistence. It's very hard. Well, it's impossible to do anything about the persistence on a wine, except to have good quality raw material in the first place and great intensity of the grapes that you're making the wine from. Winemakers can fiddle around with other things to play with the flavour a little, but a winemaker can't play with persistence. It's just either there or it's not, or the degree which it's there is very much a factor based on the quality of the grapes. So we've got 3 Rieslings of very varying styles. Now, bearing in mind that most Australian and in fact French white wine would be around, certainly Australian Chardonnay and other Australian white wines would have an alcohol level around about somewhere from 12.5, 13, maybe up to 14%. 14% is getting pretty high, I suppose, for a white wine. But people are used to that sort of level. One exception is Hunter Valley Semion, which is often deliberately picked at a very low level of ripeness, because the Hunter Valley being a pretty warm place, if you pick grapes on the unripe side, you can have high natural acidity, and natural acidity is a very good thing for having a very good stable fermentation, and then for the wine to age well and keep in the bottle. So Hunter Valley Semion is an exception, because a lot of Hunter Valley Semion is about 11%, maybe even lower sometimes. But other than that, most Australian whites are certainly higher in alcohol. When you look at these Rieslings, a lot of discussion often goes to the concept of their alcohol level, and so this Saar Riesling is 9.5% is the alcohol level, which is pretty low. So when you taste the wine is fresh and light, and it doesn't have the heaviness and the fuller body that you associate with higher alcohol. There's a certain grapiness about the aroma, and that's part of the German Riesling formula. And the wine is delicious with certain foods. I mean, the traditional food for these sorts of wines were the not antipasto, but German roll mops and preserved fish and oysters and cold seafood dishes and so on was the classic accompaniment. And I'm just going to quickly show you. I've got just a map of France here to show you where Germany is, if I can find this. Oh, hang on, I'll have to come back to that. I've got a map. I had a map of Germany. It's there are the two regions of Germany that are particularly famous, and one is the Rheingau, which is, I suppose, well, I'd say it's probably the most famous, best area for Riesling in the world. But the Moselle River Valley is also well known, and in Australia, Australians tend to go for Moselle wines because if you're my age or Ken's age even, you'd remember when Australia was allowed to use names like Moselle. We used to call it Moselle, M-O-S-E-L-L-E. We misspelt it even, and that meant any sort of fruity, slightly sweet white wine. But the use of those names was banned in the late 1980s, and it's a name that's gone, but a lot of Australians still remember it. And so Moselle wines do sell a bit in Australia. Moselle's even colder than the Rheingau. Anyway, the Saar, which is this area, is a little tributary off the Moselle. So we're talking a really cold part of Germany. And this is where even in these warmer vintages that Germany's experienced in recent years, it's still pretty cold. And so the wines, the grapes don't ripen as fully as you expect in Australia. They retain quite a degree of acidity as a result. And what is often the case is that the German winemaker will choose to make the fermentation stop before all the sugar's been fermented. Because if you ferment those very cold region German Rieslings to dryness, and they are truly dry, the acidity is too strong. You need something to balance the acidity. And the great balancing thing for acidity is a little bit of sweetness. In this case, natural sweetness. It's not added. It's actually the sweetness that's in the grapes themselves when they were harvested. And that's how you can actually get a little bit of a balance. Now, just one quick side discussion there, that Germany has a dual labeling system where the true quality German wines don't add sugar or sweetness, and they actually put on the label that they're wines of distinction as a result of that. And the expression on German wine, they say Qualitätswein mit Prädikat, which means QMP. You see it on labels. And that tells you that there's no sugar added. And that's the highest degree of German wine. The second level is where they don't add sugar, but they can add, after the fermentation's taken place, they can actually add grape juice from the same grapes and the same degree of ripeness. They can add that in at the end and adjust the sweetness. And that's a different system. The other one was called QMP. This is QBA, Qualitätswein bestimmte Anbaugebieten, or words to that effect. And anyway, you see QBA, but they cheat a little, and the Germans put on the labels, they just put Qualitätswein, and they don't actually distinguish any further than that. So the wine we have tonight is Qualitätswein, so it's from the second degree. If you get the top echelon of German wine, they put the whole thing down. They either put Qualitätswein mit Prädikat or QMP. If they just put Qualitätswein, that means it's the second level. So this wine we have tonight has had some unfermented grape juice added to it after the fermentation's over. And that's how the German winemakers get a little adjustment to the taste of the wine. And without that bit of grapiness addition to the wine, it would be too tart, too sour, too dry. So obviously the trick, if you're going to make a dry wine, and the current fad in Germany is to try and produce dry Riesling, and they're usually labeled Trocken. The current fad, therefore, is to make sure that your grapes are ripe enough where you don't have too much acidity. So you can still carry quite a bit of acidity, but there's enough ripeness of the grapes to give you enough alcohol. Because alcohol, like sweetness, is a great balancing thing for acidity. So if you've got a high acid wine, you either have to have a little bit of sweetness, or you need to have a degree of alcohol that gives it the balance. So a lot of these new crop of Trocken German Rieslings are 12% alcohol. So they're up in the sort of conventional level of alcohol that you see on a lot of Australian wines. So the second one, which is the Australian Clare Valley Riesling, is it tastes about 11.5 or so. It's 11.7. It says, so near enough to 12%, and that's pretty much typical. That's what you'd expect in an Australian Riesling. So when you move from the German one to the Australian, it's dry. There's a certain creamy richness as well as that acidity. Quite acidic, that Clare Valley Riesling. It's quite tart, quite stony tasting. Imagine sucking a pebble. There's a sort of a stony, dry kind of hardness about it, which in fact is why a lot of people don't like Riesling, because Riesling has this fairly firm, penetrating, stony style acidity. Whereas if you can think about New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc, or for that matter, the German Riesling style with its firm acidity. But if you go to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and for that matter, Loire Valley Sauvignon Blanc, there's high acidity on Sauvignon Blanc, but it's a different type of acidity. It's a different shape. The acidity of Sauvignon Blanc is a very etchy. Your palate has a very abrasive, etchy feel. And it does mean that Sauvignon Blanc is a very high impact tasting wine. And there's a fullness, full body style on Sauvignon Blanc with a lot of this etchy, attacking acidity on it, which a lot of people like. Whereas the acidity on Riesling is very penetrating, very stony. I can read them. I'm reading the rude messages as well. So in answer to your question, David, obviously if you've got a Riesling or any white wine that has high acidity, they'll obviously age well. That's one of the things. High natural acidity does equip a wine to age slowly. One of the things about Riesling, though, is that as they age, their fruitiness does change. And if you've got quite a bit of acidity and you do let it age a bit and it softens, what is quite common is that the lime juice aroma. Well, in the case of the Clare Valley wine, it's quite a that unsweetened lime cordial, mixer cordial. There's a number of brands. That's the smell of the Clare Valley Riesling, and I quite like that lime juice character. When Rieslings age, often that lime juice becomes quite almost like a lime liqueur, and some of them take on this aromatic, almost petrol-y aroma. German Rieslings do it as well. It tends to happen if there's quite a degree of ripeness. So if you get German Rieslings, these new style German Rieslings that are being made at 11, 12, 12.5%, they take on a lime and kerosene petrol-y aroma. So I've actually had some 2014, which is a very hot year in Europe, 2014 German Rieslings, and already they're quite petrol-y. And to me, I'd rather have the vibrant, lifted, scented lime juice, not the petrol-y kerosene flavour. But there are certainly people around who love that kerosene, thick, rich, viscous old Riesling style. If you ever go to special VIP tasting at some of the traditional Australian wine producers and they wanted to show you something super special that you can't buy, often they'll pull out old Riesling. And you get older winemakers and older owners, and they love these really old Rieslings. So certainly places like Orlando and the Barossa Valley and Brown Brothers in Victoria and other producers famous for producing 20-year-old Rieslings. To me, they're interesting and nice, but they always taste a bit like lime juice liqueur, as distinct from, a fresh wine, but, interesting. I mean, they always keep well because they've got that high natural acidity.
May I add a comment in there, Andrew?
Yes, of course.
I absolutely agree with you. I think when they get too old and lose their fresh fruit character and get too petrol-y, they're not very nice. But what I've actually got here is the Wilson's DJW 2016. Now, this is now at a stage that's a perfect balance between those two things. It's just picking up enough of that slightly terpene-y, almost, petrol-y, but not really. But it gives it somehow gives the fruit character that length and strength.
Yep.
It doesn't stay in that phase for that long until it changes.
Yeah, I think if you can get them, I quite like Australian Rieslings at 2 to 3 years of bottle age. So Rieslings are normally released the same year as vintage. So we'll be seeing the 2021 Rieslings about October, November this year. And you can still buy 2020 Rieslings. And by now, 2019, there's probably a few around, but most of those would be sold out. And of course, that's as old as you can find them. But if you do like a particular Riesling, and certainly Australia's got a whole roll call of really classic, good Riesling producers. If you buy, say 6 bottles, so you could still go and buy 2020 Riesling. If you age those, even only 2 years will have a really good effect. As you're saying, Ken, the wine will soften a little, the acidity's still there, the lime juiciness will concentrate a little, but it won't have gone into the lime juice cordial or liqueur, or let alone petrol just yet. So I have a sort of a cycling program where I buy certain Rieslings that I like and put them away for 2 years. So right now I've got an array, well, it's gone in the cold weather now, I suppose, but this last summer hot weather, I had 2017 and 2018 Rieslings, which were terrific. And there was the odd 2016, so I sort of make a mixed box and stick them away and then bring them back again. But I've got 19 and 20, and I'll be buying 21s later this year and put them away and just roll them through. It's always interesting to see. I tend to buy the same ones, a few from the Clare Valley and a few from Eden Valley. And the other area in Australia that's really good for it is the Franklin River area of the southern bit of Western Australia. There's 2 famous producers there, Franklin River Estate itself and Alcumi, and they both make terrific Riesling in that part of the world, and they're pretty good. So I buy a few of those too and bring them back after a year or so. Riesling's grown in quite a few places around Australia, but the 3 most famous areas with the track record would be Clare Valley, Eden Valley, and Franklin River. But you also get Riesling in northern and inland Victoria. So Great Western has, particularly Bess, has got a really famous Riesling. And there are other producers actually grown pretty successfully. Canberra, yeah. Canberra's got
and Ravensworth is.
Or Helm, because Helm Wines in Canberra's been pushing Riesling for some time as a bit of a thing. One of the tips for Riesling, I think, is to wait until the annual round of wine shows is over, and then look in 1 or 2 of the different wine shows. The big capital city wine shows will do. So Brisbane wine show's on in a few weeks' time, and the results will be on the website. But you can look at sort of maybe Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, whatever wine shows, and go to the Riesling section. And it's fairly common that the trophy and then the top medals are across a repeat group of producers. So usually there's half a dozen or more producers that are doing it really well, that year. And they'll even though the different judges, that those Rieslings will do really well at a different array of wine shows. Now, knowing that, you can then go looking for those 2021 Rieslings by about October, November when they're in the shops. And it's quite common to be able to buy Rieslings that have won gold medals and even trophies in the shops for maybe, low 20s, maybe mid 20s. You can buy trophy winning Australian Riesling for $25. And every now and then you see a Riesling, going a bit over $30. Not many. To sell a Riesling in Australia beyond $30, it's got to be very famous, great track record, won lots of trophies, very desirable, trendy wine, or whatever it might be. So you can buy Riesling very inexpensively. So if you get a bit of a taste, I have a taste for it. I buy quite a lot of it, but it's not to everybody's taste. My wife doesn't really like Riesling that much, so if I open one, she'll have a little bit. But there's something about that very cutting acidity. She just doesn't like it. It's just too sour, too biting, too aggressive. Even the ones that are 2 and 3 and 4 years old, she's not that keen. In the really hot weather and so on, she'll have some, but you'd just rather have anything else. I mean, Semion's got a softer acidity. Certainly, elegant Chardonnay is the big favourite. So Riesling is just one of those things. It's intriguing with those that like it and don't like it. Now on to the third one. So in Australia, quite a few Australian producers noted that Riesling's got this sort of reputation, this very mixed reputation. It's got the dry, acidic Rieslings are favoured by those that like that sort of thing, but otherwise they don't sell particularly well. And they don't sell outside South Australia. So what some Australian producers have done is they said, well, why don't we sort of keep the Riesling quality good, but why don't we go back to that style of Riesling or Riesling blend that was around in Australia, back in the 1970s. So why don't we deliberately make a sweet, grapey, fruity Riesling? And why don't we advertise it? Let's not pretend that we're trying to make a dry Riesling that we've smuggled a bit of sweetness into. Because normally, unless you're doing dessert wine, if you mention that the wine is grapey or sweet, most Australians think it's unsophisticated. Interestingly, most British consumers are the same. You can do it yourself. If people come over and you say, oh, look, I've got a choice of wines. What would you like? I've got a bone dry, really acidic something or other. And I've got this really fantastic, super duper trophy winning wine, very elegant, but it's a little bit grapey. It's a bit grapey and fruity, just a touch sweet. And 99 times out of 100 people say, oh, no, I'll have the dry one, thank you. Because admitting you drink sweet is sort of like admitting you're unsophisticated. It's sophisticated to drink dry. So these new crop of producers in Australia that are doing these Rieslings that are deliberately made sweet, they're very coy about admitting too openly that they're actually sweet. This one actually says, this is a Tasmanian, and this one actually does say medium sweet on the label, which is one of the first times I've seen wine saying that. But you'll notice that it's called FGR, and that's what they used to call themselves. FGR means 40 grams residual. Now, 40 grams per litre of residual sweetness is actually quite a bit. So the average, like a Chardonnay, a commercial white wine in Australia that's deliberately made a little bit grapey, just to make it palatable, might be 10, 12, 15 grams per litre. And usually you can taste that, you can detect that. But when you go to 40 grams, that's actually quite a lot. And so this wine here is quite openly advertising on its label that it's 40 grams of residual, FGR. Mind you, got to read the back label to see that, but now they're saying medium sweet. And I don't know that they're entirely successful in appealing to Australian consumers as being sophisticated, but Tasmanian wine in general has got a pretty desirable image. So they're, selling steadily. And so you do get these styles, because where these type of wines really shine are in Thai style, Thai, coriander, spicy, green curry, a whole array of different Asian food is where that slightly grapey style of Australian Riesling, well, and for that matter, German Riesling, goes over really well. So that when you come to the Tasmanian Riesling after you've settled in on the others, of course, it does taste pretty sweet, but it's good. I talked about the aging of Rieslings, and you can do it pretty well. You've just got to be a bit careful. And then I can see a few comments about some of the famous Rieslings that you can buy. Certainly Jim Barry in Clare Valley is certainly a famous brand, but there's a whole range of producers that are in the Clare Valley that are really well known. Petaluma, of course, is a famous brand. I particularly like a Leary Walker, which is a very dry style, and the searing acidity intensity on a Leary Walker is not to everybody's taste. I think it's a very dry, very great intensity, fantastic persistence, but there's almost a sour dryness on the acidity of a Leary Walker. In Clare Valley, they actually have some sub-regions, and there's around the Clare township itself. At the southern end of the Clare Valley, it's where it's very rocky, a bit more arid, and it's actually a slaty soil type there, and so you see a number of different Rieslings made in that part of the world. And then just slightly east of there in the middle part, but the eastern side of Clare Valley, is a region called Polish Hill River, or PHR. And Polish Hill River is a fruitier, softer, more perfumed, a more grapey, floral. There's a real floral flower arrangements aroma on Polish Hill River Rieslings. And I think people seek them out. And so a lot of producers in Clare Valley that produce Riesling from vineyards in that sub-region very much advertise on the label that it's Polish Hill River. So if you wanted to try a Clare Valley wine, I thoroughly recommend that in an exploration, you'd start with Polish Hill River as being one of the most delightful styles of German Riesling. If you go more towards the Clare township itself, or down near the Watervale town, the wines are firmer in the acidity and more steely, stony to taste. So there are these sub-regions, and in itself, that's very, very interesting. There's a new sort of sub-area of Clare Valley out to the west, which is generally known as Skillagalli Valley, and there's actually Skillagalli wines itself. But there's a few producers in that part of the world. It's a much more forested eucalypt area there, and the wines are lighter. They don't have the steely intensity of the main part, but they're still nice wines. Quite different to Eden Valley. Eden Valley wines are usually very lemony, and they have that almost lemonade lemon aroma on them, and they have a really zesty lemony aroma, and that's how you can sort of tell the difference. So in comparing, say, Hunter Valley Semion to Eden Valley Riesling, that can be pretty tricky because Hunter Valley Semion is renowned for its lemony aroma. Hunter Valley Semion normally is into a lemon pith, lemon skin, and if there's a little bit of age, they start to get a little bit of that walnut character. Eden Valley Rieslings tend to be much more pure in the lemon character, and they've got this tingling acidity, I find, whereas Hunter Valley Semion tends to have very soft acidity. You don't tend to see the acidity as firmly as if it's a Riesling. But I can tell you, if you get Eden Valley Riesling and Hunter Valley Semion, and they're both relatively young wines, they can be very difficult to tell apart, and I've made that mistake before. So they're not dissimilar in style.
Andrew, can I just ask about, sorry, we were a bit unseen, but yeah, apologies. No, we're drinking a Tasmanian Penfolds Traminer 2014, which is just beautiful. Can you mention just something about the Traminer variety versus Riesling? Because they're very similar on my taste buds.
Yeah, so Gewürztraminer is the full name. That's too much of a mouthfeel for many people, so the name is often shortened to Traminer. But there's no legal definition for Traminer. So you may find that where the front label says Traminer, you may go to the back label and it may be a Gewürztraminer Riesling blend, maybe. I don't know whether they'll tell you or not on that one. Gewürztraminer certainly ripens more readily. It's a earlier ripener. and it therefore is more successful in growing in really cold areas. Now, Riesling tends to be a medium late ripener, and that means often in Germany or Alsace, that late in autumn, where the growers looking to get ripeness of the Riesling, the nights are starting to get longer, the days are shorter, and you can often struggle to get really good ripeness. Gewürztraminer is already ripened. So in Alsace, in northeastern France, there's Gewürztraminer and Riesling grown side by side, and the Gewürztraminer is harvested much earlier. So Gewürztraminer tends to have higher alcohol, and Gewürztraminer also has a grapiness about it, but there's a spicy grapiness about Gewürz. And if Gewürz is too ripe, it can often be too full-bodied, too viscous, too cloying. At the moment, in Alsace, which is a very cold part of France, because of this global warming thing, they're struggling with their Gewürztraminers there. Traditionally, for centuries, the early ripening Gewürz was prized as being a really good white wine style. But in recent years, the Gewürz has ripened too quickly, and they got too much alcohol. And so there's a bit of blending going on there as well to try and use the later ripening, more acidic Riesling to freshen up the Gewürz. With Australian wine, the Gewürz and Riesling blend was the basis of that wine I mentioned before, the Lindemans Benin. And Gewürztraminer for decades afterwards was considered very unsophisticated, and you couldn't sell it. So a lot of Gewürztraminer in Australia was either dug up or grafted to something else. But quite a bit of it survived, not a lot, but quite a bit. And the producers who hung on to it have gone to more traditional Alsace, not the more recent global warming style Alsace, but the traditional Alsace, where the wine has got some delicacy and some spicy grapiness. You almost get there's a lychee, interesting oriental fruit aroma on Gewürztraminer, which is much more alluring, much bigger, much broader than Riesling. Riesling's prized for its delicacy. And yeah, you just mentioned there, Wyndham TR2 is another one. It's another one in the Lindemans Benin Moselle style. It is a high volume stainless steel tank made wine. Being polite, it's known as an entry level white wine. That means it's for a consumer who's just discovering white wine, and they're usually pretty young, and they don't know much about wine, and initially they get hooked in on the slightly grapey, sweetness thing. Very pleasant. Australian high volume Traminer Rieslings are very well made, and they're well balanced. They're fresh. They're good, and in spicy Thai restaurants, you can do well with a bottle of Wyndham Estate TR2 would go pretty well. Wolfblas has got a terrific Traminer Riesling. David, you mentioned the Penfolds. Penfolds play around with a few of these things as well. They've actually got a Riesling. They've got a Penfolds Reserve Riesling, which is Eden Valley, which is pretty smart Riesling. So there are a number of these wines around, and I think they're worth exploring. You'll certainly be against the consumer trend if you go for Rieslings and Traminer Riesling, because outside of South Australia, Australians just don't drink them. They're not interested. And Riesling are normally pretty good prices. One of the frustrations is when you go to, a lot of restaurants in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne, and you think a Riesling might be a good thing if it's hot weather. There aren't any because consumers don't order them. So, or maybe you see one. Riesling's very good wine to sell by the glass because once you open it, it keeps really well because that high level of acidity equips it really well to age, and they don't oxidize very easily. So, it's I think it's something to keep an eye out for. So, So Amy and Todd, what do you think? You're probably fairly new to trying Riesling. Are you enjoying these tonight? What do you think of these three? I'm interested in because some of the rest of us have probably drunk a fair bit of it, but what do you think of these?
I'm not a huge fan of Riesling so far, but I do like the Clare Valley. I quite enjoy that one. Todd prefers the first one, the Saar from Germany.
Yeah, the Saar, actually, it's funny you said like a Semion. The Saar, I sort of thought, wow, that's a lot like a Semion, just not quite the citrusy and a little bit sort of candy more than a Semion. But we're starting, you're talking about sort of seeing Semions, we're starting to see a lot more, Rieslings by the glass at sort of smaller wine bars and places that we're going to. Just, there'll be one or two where before, like you say, you would have seen nothing. But we're starting to see at your very small boutique sort of
fine dining type of.
Riesling's a good choice to sell by the glass where the particular venue is unsure as to how quickly they'll turn the wines over, because the good Riesling with a screw cap and keep it in the fridge. And if you're using gas, you can gas them. They'll last days and days and days. When the bottle gets down to a low level, I guess they oxidize a bit, but Rieslings will go really well. Whereas complex Chardonnays might only last a couple of days.
That last Riesling, the Frogmore Creek, at this time of the night before dinner, I can't finish the glass.
No, it's too sweet, isn't it?
It's too sweet.
Yeah. And I think I don't think that wine's had that much consumer acceptance. I think it's a style they're pushing, and sommeliers like it, and the magazines push it a bit. And this Frogmore Creek FGR has been a bit of a darling of the, of people writing about Tasmania. Almost every article you see on Tasmanian wines got Frogmore Creek FGR in it. They always finish off talking about it. And yes, it's too sweet, actually. Anyway, try it with some dessert, Todd.
Yeah.
Yeah, the poached pears, the stewed fruit later on, something like that, or maybe a stronger than usual green Thai style curry might be the go. Maybe that'll bring it along. So, Frederick and Hannah, what do you think of these? Have you had much Australian Riesling before?
Not so much. So we really like the acidity. I probably have a slight preference for the German one. But I was pleasantly surprised because actually, and also your explanation was very helpful. I was put off back in Europe by the German Rieslings because whenever we went into a restaurant, I would always say, oh no, they're going to serve the petrol again. I was sort of put off by this. It must have been all the Rieslings, very petrol-y, and I really didn't like that anymore. And so this is much sort of fresher and acidity. So I like that, very much.
Yeah, it's good. It's Germans drink a lot of their own wine. A lot of Riesling stays in Germany. I think they've probably struggled with export. A lot of the world, if it's German wine, just want cheap Liefermilch, the Blue Nun and all the other Riesling blends. And Ken could remember the UK wine trade when there were, gallons and gallons of the stuff. It was just such a popular wine. But the better Riesling seem to stay in Germany. On the trips I've been there, you go to really good restaurants, and the German restaurants are so proud of their Riesling. So we went to one in the Rheingau, actually. It was on the banks of the Rhine River in a really famous wine producing region. And it was called, I can remember to this day, it was called Zum Krug was the name of it. It was a fabulous place. And they had this wine list, and in the front of the wine list in German, but in a little subtitle English bit, it said, this wine list contains more than 5,000 selections. And it was a massive wine list. It was a really big, thick book, but with tabs. And then it went on and it said, this wine list has 8 wines that are not made of Riesling. So they had 5,000, so 4,992 wines of Riesling and 8 wines of something else. They had a number of Australian Rieslings actually, which is interesting, but the Rieslings were set out by minute sub-regions of Germany. So they had the Mosel and the Rheingau. Then you went to the Rheingau, they had sub-bits. And then they had all these different vintages. And the Germans eating in this restaurant really reveled in ordering and enjoying the older Rieslings. They just seemed to like it. And the people that ran the restaurant knew, we were Australians and we're interested in wine. And they said, if you're interested in something, we've got a lot of wines by the glass, but if you're really interested in something, we can open the bottle for you. And if you drink half the bottle, we'll sell the other half of the bottle to other people, which they did. And the Germans, we did try one older Riesling. And as you just said, Frederick, it was lovely, but it had gone in, I wouldn't say petrol-y, but it had gone into that lime juice liqueur sort of style. And it was quite old, but it was pretty good, but interesting. So they had all these sub-regions of, there's that Rheingau area has a number of different areas, but there's a famous village just to the east, just where the Rhine River does it, the big famous 90-degree bend, and it's called Hochheim. And starting, I don't know, centuries ago, that wine was the most popular expensive wine imported into the UK. And the British called it Hock for short, and they misspelt it. It was H-O-C-H-A. They called it H-O-C-K, and that's where the name came from. And so to this day, of course, in the UK wine trade, when you talk about Hock, they mean that slightly fruity, fresh white wine from Germany. Some British consumers know that it's made of Riesling, but most people don't care. They just know that it's a slightly fruity white wine. And it was a name that was kicking around for a long time. In Australia, we had the name Hock as well for a bit until it got banned. And God knows what was in it in Australia. It was what it was left over after you'd made all the serious wines. And a sort of a dryish blend in an Australian winery would be sort of put together in a stainless steel tank and bottled off and just labelled Hock, H-O-C-K. And it did sell. One of the most famous wines around, I can remember when I first got interested in wine, was a pretty good Riesling blend, actually, from the Clare Valley, and it was called Quelltaler Hock. How about that? Quelltaler Hock. And Quelltaler got bought out and changed and whatever, and became part of Annie's Lane, which is part of Mildara, which is part of Wolfblas. But there's such a glut of Riesling that Treasury Wine Estates that owns the Wolfblas label is actually flogged off part of that ancient old vineyard back to O'Leary Walker, actually, and they're reinvigorating the Quelltaler name, their very original name of the vineyards. And so it'd be interesting to see what wines they come up with in the future. But certainly I find that off-duty wine judges and winemakers, particularly when it's warmer weather, they drink Riesling, no doubt about it. A little bit of Hunter Semion, but they drink Riesling. If the weather's colder, well, maybe a glass of Riesling and then move to a Chardonnay and so on. But when the weather's warmer, winemakers drink Riesling. And the delicacy, the persistence, the thing that is so good about Riesling is it's for such a delicate, light-bodied wine. It's got such fabulous persistence. And if you find yourself coming back to it, it's a very enticing attribute of that wine to have such a thing. And you can line really good Riesling up with other wines, and you'll find, especially on the second night when you come back to them, that the Riesling with that persistence is a really lovely thing. Any questions or comments or about Riesling or our things tonight? Ken, do you have a wine of the week, a wine of the month, a wine of the fortnight for us tonight? We've all got our pens and pads poised ready to write this down.
Well, you've mentioned one of the ones I was thinking of earlier, the Alchemy.
Oh, yeah.
Black label. Don't buy the white label. That's a little bit down market. That's what Andrew would refer to as entry level. But the Alchemy black label is superb, and it's not expensive. It's $24 a bottle or something. But you mentioned the Grampians, didn't you, a few weeks ago?
Yeah.
There are some very interesting Rieslings from the Grampians. And one of the ones I had that I was going to make a wine of the week was the Fallen Giants.
Fallen Giant. Okay. Yeah.
And I think it had a little bit of Lee's aging or something. It's got a very interesting textural quality to it.
I could have mentioned that I didn't. Germany traditionally would give the Riesling a little bit of skin contact. They'd do a light crush, whole bunches, light crush, leave it steeping, leave the crushed juice with its skins overnight, just overnight, and then run the juice away. And if the juice picks up a little bit of the solid material, they'd allow that. And then some German producers then age that juice in very cold conditions, so fermentation doesn't start. They actually age the juice for maybe 4 or 5 days in old, large oak barrels. And it ever so slightly, I wouldn't say it oxidizes, but it polymerizes some of the acidity a little bit, and it picks up some palate texture from all the little bits of solid material that are allowed in there. And then they do the normal fermentation. And you get a really interesting palate feel on those top German Rieslings as a result of that. Now, arguably, some of the Rheingau producers have gone a bit far with that, and often you get these really, particularly with this global warming thing, and some of the Rheingau Rieslings are very full-bodied. Typically in Australia, that's not been what producers do. In Australia, it would be pick the grapes, crush, run the juice straight away, and then in Australia, traditionally, Australian winemakers would settle the juice, keep it really cold so fermentation doesn't start, settle it, not filter it, they wouldn't filter it, but they'd certainly settle it. And then they'd run off the settled juice and it was crystal clear. And one of the things that many of us have done is if you go to a winery doing a lot of Riesling, they go to the big stainless steel tank and they'll draw off some wine up off the bottom so there's no settled matter in it. And they'll give you a glass and it tastes like apple juice, this acidic, fresh, grapey juice. And that's what they ferment. And that's why you get these super clean Australian Rieslings until recently. And now most big Riesling producers still make the traditional Australian method, but quite a few Australian producers are experimenting with the German method. So O'Leary Walker, for example, has got a reserve Riesling which they call the Doctor's Cut. And it's off a particular vineyard owned by a group of doctors, and they buy all the grapes. And they actually do a 1 or 2 day skin contact, and then all that sort of thing to sort of follow a little bit of the German method. So it's one of those interesting things, and I guess you'll see a little bit of that with German Rieslings if you start getting into it a bit. So it's good. So Alchemy Black Label Riesling is Ken's pick this fortnight, this week.
Fallen Giants, a double pick.
And Fallen Giants, very good. Okay. Well, in 2 weeks' time, we'll do Winter Reds, and we've got a bit of an interesting array for you there. We'll talk about other winter styles too. It was hard to get an Amarone, getting at a good Amarone in Australia is very difficult. So I had a look, Frederick, but it was hard. And in fact, I really couldn't find one at an affordable price. And I tried quite an expensive Amarone from Wine Experience a couple of months ago just to try it out. And it was a very famous Italian wine. It was very full. It was very...
Quintarelli.
Yeah, well, it was very acetic. Had a lot of, it was quite a volatile style, which, yeah.
So when you say quite expensive, Andrew, how expensive? 60, 70?
Yeah, 60, 70 bucks a bottle. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, the last one I had,
it wasn't that good.
I didn't think it was worth it. It's a difficult area, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult area.
It's fun to try if you've got some cash burning a hole in your pocket.
Yeah, but, I like fresh Valpolicella rather than the Amarone version. I think Valpolicella, well made, is not unlike Pinot Noir. It's juicy and, red berry fruity, and to make an Amarone style out of it, you've got to be pretty careful because that acetaldehyde creeps into it pretty quickly, and that's it can be okay.
I often find the Valpolicellas a bit what I call lollipoppy.
I think you can get Valpolicella is guilty as well as the same as Lambrusco or Beaujolais. There's the cheap, pretty light, dilute fruity version, and then there are the better ones. And and Valpolicella, the light cherry, red cherry, fruity one, is a bit lollipoppy. Yes, I agree. Yeah. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll get together and try some winter reds and have a talk about that. So I look forward to that. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the Rieslings. The 3 Rieslings will keep very easily now for quite a few nights. Todd and Amy, if you work your way down, you'll have to find some strong green curry Thai style for tomorrow night, which will go with that. And then by about Wednesday or Thursday, when you've got half a bottle of that one left, you could poach some pears or apples or something in it and get the fruity grapiness into it and do one of those desserts so that the sweet Riesling doesn't go to waste. All right, gang. Well, lovely to see you all. Yeah, Ken's still boasting about how many bottles he's got in his cellar there. You won't finish those in your lifetime, will you?
That's the whole idea.
Laura, we've become grandparents. So there is grandson Max being held up by Laura.
Yay.
Yeah. So Max is 3 weeks old.
Wasn't it Raymond Postgate who was supposed to have finished his last bottle of Tokai on his deathbed and left nothing in his cellar?
We're talking babies, forget the wine.
Max is probably getting some Riesling fumes tonight from Laura after Laura's probably had a sip of a few Rieslings. Hope it makes him sleep really well. So she's Laura's gone off there, but they mother and baby coping very well for first-time mothers, so they're going well. They live not far from us, so we see a little bit of them, or Barbara goes and sees them quite a bit, so they're going really well.
Well done. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks very much, David. Yeah, no, it's lovely to be grandparents for the first time. How about that? It's good. But Laura's still finding time out from looking after Max to look after my website and a few things and send out the emails and whatever. So you'll hear from Laura again in almost 2 weeks' time about our next session. Enjoy Sunday night, enjoy dinner. We'll go and have a glass of Riesling ourselves now with something or other, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time. Good night all.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.